but also in terms of sort of human nature and the perennial dilemmas of societies all over the globe. So let's look at the very first Rashi, the first verse of the Parsha. And and this is one where the English translation is not going to be helpful to understanding the Hebrew, unfortunately. So I have to translate it for you and give you a little bit of an explication. Okay. Vayomer Moshe, Moses said, Ko Amar Adonai, thus said Adonai, Ka Chatzot Halayla Ani Yotzei Betoch Mitzrayim. Okay, and Chatzot means midnight. Okay, and we'll get into Rashi will get into exactly more what the precise meaning of that term Chatzot is, but the relevant word here is not the Chatzot part, it's the Ka Chatzot part. Okay, and that's why the English translation is useless, because those of you who know Hebrew or some Hebrew, what does ka mean?
Because
like, it means like, right? So right. Or around, depending on the context, right? But if you said to somebody in modern Hebrew, I will be at your house kechatzot, right? You would understand that as I will be at your house around midnight, right? Where if you said I will be at your house bechatzot, I will be at your house at midnight, right? And there's a difference between bechatzot at midnight and kechatzot around midnight, right? And you don't get that at all from the translation, unfortunately. Okay, so kechatzot halayla kamo ka. All right, so first of all, he's giving you, he says, when the night is divided, kechatzot is like when the meal offering was offered up, ke'alot, when their anger was kindled against us, ba'harot. Okay, this is its simple meaning, which fits its context that chatzot is not a noun denoting a half. Okay, so in this part, in other words, because we have another verse where it says Vayihi bechatzi halayla, right? And so Rashi here is saying that chatzot is also not exact. It's not exactly midnight. It's around. It's right. It's more or less. Now, midnight in halachic terms, right? Now, some of you know this because we've also looked at this in terms of like prayer times and so on and so forth. There's this idea, it's called sha'ot zmani ot in Hebrew, or I use the term halachic hours. Okay, so that a halachic hour is not 60 minutes. A halachic hour in the daytime is 1/12 of the daylight hours. Okay, and a halachic hour in the evening is half of the dark hours, right? So chatzot is not midnight according to the clock, right? It's halfway between dusk and dawn the next day. Okay. Now, how precise they actually measured time in Egypt 3,500 years ago, I no, I mean, it's a serious question, because certainly now the Talmud is certainly much later than the Exodus. But in the Talmud, they have very, very precise calculations. I mean, they could calculate time extremely precisely, and I mean, perhaps the Egyptians could too. I don't know. I mean, they certainly knew engineering pretty well, and if they knew engineering pretty well, there's no reason to assume that they didn't, have a fairly precise way of measuring time. Okay, so kechatzot, he brings other, he's just bringing other verses where you have the participle ke as well.
So,
Okay,
question.
yeah.
So in the Haggadah, when you sing Vayehi B'chatzi Halayla, it's ba.
Right.
Yeah. So are you saying that that's it's overly accurate, or
No, it's a
did they take liberties, or is this another angel on a pinhead?
how important. I'm just explicating the text, not the importance of the text. Okay. No, B'chatzi Halayla really means precisely at midnight.
Yeah.
It's a different. It's not the same. These are two different occurrences. Kechatzot is when Moses is going out to pray. Okay, B'chatzi Halayla is when they left Egypt. Okay, so the time that they left Egypt is, the language is more precise, at least midrashically, right? And there's all kinds of stuff that, is not, I'm not super expert in, but it had to be precise because the time that slavery was supposed to last was calculated to the second, and therefore the Exodus had to be calculated to the second, right? So, but this is precisely, there's the contrast between kechatzot halayla here and b'chatzi halayla later on in the same parsha. Okay, although not in our triennial.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, but now we're going to understand it midrashically. Okay, kehatzi halayla, at about midnight. And they said that Moses said kechatzot, about midnight, meaning near it, either before it or after it, but he did not say bechatzot, at midnight, lest Pharaoh's astrologers err and then say Moses is a liar. But the Holy One, blessed be he who knows his times, and his second said bechatzot. Okay, so in other words, right, Moses says around midnight because he's afraid that he'll be accused of lying if it's not precisely at midnight, but not because he will not be leaving the city precisely at midnight, but because Pharaoh has astrologers, right? The astrologers are experts in calculating, but maybe they're not as expert as all that, right? And so they will miscalculate when midnight is, and that's not precisely when Moses leaves. So Moses is sort of preemptively being vague so that he won't be accused of fake news. Right? I mean, I just think it's really kind of funny. I mean, Moses is worried about being accused of saying something that's inaccurate, right? So he's purposely vague, right? And I mean, Mike, I'm sure that in your career at the State Department, there were times when you were purposely vague, right? Because if you said something precise, you had no wiggle room, You could
Exactly.
be right.
Well, not just
So
I mean, you saw it yesterday when the press secretary was answering questions 6 hours after they got inaugurated. And she was answering, and she was deliberately not precise because it would be silly. People were trying to paint her in a corner, and she had no
right,
interest in that, and he had no interest in that.
right. So, so here is Moses with the same exact concern, right? So the same exact concern that if he's too precise. Now, of course, that's the problem. The problem is not that he would be wrong, but he would be thought wrong, even though he was right, because they don't have the expertise to really know that he's right. Okay. Any questions or comments on that? Great. So we'll move on. All right. So the next verse. And every firstborn in the land of Egypt will die, from the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on the throne to the firstborn of the slave woman who is behind the millstones, and every firstborn animal. Okay. Before we look at Rashi, any questions that occur from this verse?
Why the animals?
Why the animals? Okay. Why the animals? Absolutely. What else?
Well, why the slave woman?
Right. Why the slave woman? Right. I mean, we're presumably there were also non-Hebrew slaves as well, right? There were non-Hebrew slaves as well. And the firstborn of the non-Hebrew slave are also going to be slain, as well as now it's interesting. Ad Bechor Hashivcha, slave woman.
The
And
slave woman could be Jewish.
Right, but it's not. I mean, that's why it's translated here as captive. No, it doesn't. It doesn't mean. The language here, shivcha, means specifically a non-Israelite slave in this context. Okay, and we'll see from Rashi's answer as well, right? But if it was a Hebrew slave, then all the more so that it's a problem, right? Because all the Hebrews are slaves. So if God is killing the firstborn of the Hebrew slaves, not exactly great redemption, right? So that's clearly not, even if you couldn't tell that linguistically, you could tell that contextually. Okay. So why is the firstborn of the captive? Why? That's what Rashi asks. Lama laku hashvuim. Why were the captives smitten? So that they would not say, our deity has demanded vengeance for our degradation and brought retribution upon Egypt. Right? In other words, God wants it to be very clear that it's God who's doing this, and it's God who's doing this on behalf of the Hebrews, on behalf of the Israelites. And so the firstborn of the non-Israelite slaves also have to die, lest they attribute it to their deity who's coming to rescue them. Right? Now, I have to say, I don't like this, right? I'll leave it at that. Right? I mean, I'm not right. I'm not required to like everything that Rashi says, but that's what he's saying. Okay, so from the firstborn of Pharaoh to the firstborn of the slave woman, all those inferior to the Pharaoh's firstborn and superior to the slave woman's firstborn were included. Why were the sons of the slave women smitten? Because they too were enslaving the Israelites and were happy about their misfortune. Okay, Now this Rashi to me is less problematic, right? In other words, right, why were the firstborn of the non-Israelite slaves, the Egyptian slaves, or what ethnically Egyptian slaves or whoever they were, because they were happy that the Israelites were enslaved. Okay, now when I said at the beginning that there's stuff that is relevant, I mean, this explains Southern whites who fought for the Confederacy, right? This explains people who vote against their own interests all the time, right? I mean, I'm not talking about like rich people, like a lot of Jews who vote against their own economic interests out of, a sense that they're doing the right thing. But, in other words, as long as there is this psychological need for somebody to be lower than me on the totem pole, right? And we saw it, we saw it not only in the Confederacy, but we saw it with, the Southern strategy, right? That all you have, it was some politician, I forget who said, all I have to do is shout the N-word louder than my opponent and I will win, right? And it also explains why, now here I'm dating myself because this was an analysis from the 70s and 80s, and frankly, I'm not as au courant with Israeli politics right now as I was then. But it explained why the Jews from Middle Eastern countries were so vociferously right wing, and against any sort of territorial compromise. And many of them were very explicit about it. If you read Amos Oz's book, In the Land of Israel, because prior to 1967, right, which brought the Palestinians from the West Bank and Gaza into the Israeli economy, who was the low man on the totem pole? The Edot HaMizrach, the Jews from the Middle Eastern countries, right? And then the Palestinians came in, and then now they're the low man on the totem pole, right? And so they were very explicit. If we have the Palestinians no longer part of our economy, we're going to go back to being the lowest. We're going to do all the, undesirable jobs, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Right?
Rabbi,
So, yeah.
isn't that similar, if not the same, to the mindset about our immigrant population who have? I want to make sure that I'm not misunderstood. I am not anti-immigration for 1 second, but isn't that similar to the feelings and the worries that mainstream America has had, that if these migrant workers, especially like coming from Mexico, aren't here to harvest our fields and plant our seeds and blah, 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 that all that labor work, same thing with repairmen and handymen, blah, 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 then we'll wind up having to do it ourselves? Isn't that, I'm not saying it very well, but isn't that a similar attitude?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't heard that expressed that much, frankly. I mean, it would be if that's people were saying that, for sure. I mean, I think quite the opposite problem. I mean, I think, right, the reason that immigrants have those jobs is because American-born people of any race don't want them.
I'm saying the same thing. I'm not using the same, I mean the same thing. I'm
Right.
not using the same words. Yes.
Right. But I don't know. I mean, here we're talking about a psychological disposition, right? And So the phenomenon is certainly the same. I think the psychological disposition is a little bit different.
Okay.
Right. But again, I mean, it's striking to me how something that Rashi said 1,000 years ago, right? And here, this is definitely, I mean, if you look in the Eitz Chaim Chumash, brings this down as well. So it's older material even than Rashi. But one of the things that I get out of this is that human nature doesn't change,
Yeah.
right? And that, I can be bought off as long as there's somebody below me on the totem pole, right? That's all I care about, right? And so, therefore, the non-Israelite slaves were higher in the pecking order than the Israelite slaves, and therefore they were fine. And therefore they had to be included in the punishment as well. And every firstborn animal. Who asked why the animals?
Did.
Right. Okay. Why the animals?
They were worshipped.
Because they were worshipped,
Right.
right? And when the Holy One, blessed be he, punishes any nation, he punishes its deity. Okay, now a couple of things about that. One is that you could just as easily have said what Rashi said in the previous verse, right? That if the firstborn animals were spared, they might attribute it to the deity-ness, the divine nature of the animals, right? But this statement from the Mechilta, when God punishes a land, he punishes his deity, right? I mean, and those of you who have been with me in this class or in the Psalms class before may remember this term, henotheism, right? And from a historical perspective, the Israelites were not originally monotheistic. They were monolatrous. Okay, what's the difference between monotheism and monolatry? Monotheism means there is only one God. Monolatry means we only worship one God.
Oh.
Right?
Yeah.
But other gods exist. That's the same. And henotheism is related to that idea. Henotheism essentially means that there are many gods, but we only worship one. But each god is in charge of a certain piece of territory, okay, as opposed to the Greco-Roman gods who as far as I know, and some of you probably know more about Greco-Roman mythology than I do, but the Greco-Roman gods were not territorial. They had specific jobs, right? They had specific jobs, not specific territories, right? But in henotheism, a god has a specific territory, right? And you say, and you could say, well, how do you know this? I mean, how do you know that that's what the Israelites originally were? I could point you to this Rashi, which is based on the Mechilta, so from like the 6th century. But I could also point you to Psalms, right? Where in one of the Psalms of the exile, the ancestors say, on the waters of Babylon, right, by the rivers of Babylon, we wept when we remembered Zion. How can we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Why can't you sing the Lord's song in a foreign land, right? Why is that a worry? And there are other places too. We'll be exiled and we'll have to worship other gods, right? But if you're worried about how can we sing God's song in a foreign land, it's because presumably some Israelites at least believe that no, you couldn't. If you are exiled to Babylonia, you have to worship the Babylonian gods. If you're exiled to Egypt, you have to worship the Egyptian gods, right? And so it was all, so the idea that there's only one God. So originally that's said no, because this is the God of Israel, meaning not, because when you talk about Israel, right, it means different things. Israel means a people, but it also means a land, right? So the God of Israel means the God of the Israelite nation, not the God of the Israel, not merely the God of the Israelite land, right? So,
I mean, there's a lot of, we bump into it a lot where, I mean, why was it so important when the temple was destroyed that there were all these laws that we didn't follow, because our religion was geographic centered? It always struck me as a bit strange. I mean, and likewise, there are lots of references to the God of Israel as a geographic thing, so even the Jews at the time recognized that there might be other gods that were otherwise occupied.
right.
Well,
But
in terms of ancient religions, each region or city, like Babylon, had its own god. Other places through there, they had the gods were, as you said, Rabbi, they were specific to an area. Because I remember reading with the Sumerians, when the Assyrians moved them, they were not. They had to leave what their original god, and this is they asked the conquerors to bring some of the priests back because they needed to worship the gods of the area, not their old gods.
right. Well,
And there's reference also to say that this God above all other gods that runs also through parts of the Torah. That
right. I mean, I think internal to the Torah is that you shall have no other gods before me, right? Why doesn't the Ten Commandments say there are no other gods?
Exactly.
Right. But in answer, so I want to respond to Mike and then to Marcia. Okay. And Mike, you've heard me say this before. You don't have to agree, or you could agree but not like it. But the Torah was not conceived as the rule book of a religion. It was conceived as the constitution of a nation, right? And therefore, all of these things can only be observed, in the same way that, go to some other country and tell the president of that country, you can't do that, it's unconstitutional.
That goes to Dina, Medina, or whatever that Hebrew.
Dina de Malchuta Dina.
Yeah,
but that's an exilic concept that's much, much later.
Okay.
But I'm coming around, Rabbi. I'm coming around.
Okay, but in answer to Marcia's point, the Samaritans, right? This is precisely the origin of the Samaritans. It is tied into that, right? When the Assyrians conquered the northern territory, right, and they sent the 10 northern tribes into exile, the 10 lost tribes, right? They didn't leave that land vacant. They brought people from all over their empire and resettled them in northern Israel, aka Samaria, right? And many of these people said, now that we are living in this territory, we have to worship the God
That was,
to whom this territory belongs,
that's what I said.
right? And they started following Israelite religious practices. But the Jews, and now Jews mean from Judea, right? I mean, this is where we're starting to get the idea of Jews say, but you're not. And even though there's such a thing as conversion, they didn't convert. They simply started practicing Israelite religion, right? To a greater or lesser extent, right? And that is the origin of the rival. And of course, subsequently, the Samaritans invented their own origin story. And if you told a Samaritan that that's where you guys really came from, they would be, I think, upset by that. But I think historically, that's indeed what happened. Okay. Anyone else? All right, Yalla, we'll move on. All right, I'm going to skip the next one. Okay, so chapter 12, verse 1. The Lord spoke to Moses and to Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, Vayomer Adonai el Moshe ve'el Aharon be'eretz Mitzrayim lemor. Okay. Anything jump out here? Gail.
Why Egypt all of a sudden? He's always saying, and they said, but not necessarily with Egypt stuck in there.
Not necessarily with Egypt stuck in there, but also not necessarily with
Aaron.
Aaron stuck in there, right?
But Aaron was in there last week. That's why I didn't say anything.
Okay, that's fine. But I mean, anybody, in God willing, one day we'll be back in the shul and we'll be reading from the Torah and there'll be Gabayim, right? And then later on in Exodus, right, I'll lose my place and somebody will helpfully tell me it's the paragraph that begins Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe. Right.
In Leviticus, everything starts that way.
Right. In Leviticus, right, everything, right, every paragraph starts Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe lemor. Right? Why Vayidaber Adonai el Moshe? Why? What? So, but here it says, right?
Both of them.
El Moshe ve'el Aharon. Okay. Right. Why Aaron? Since Aaron had worked and toiled with miracles just like Moses, he accorded him this honor at the first commandment by including him with Moses in his speech. Okay, now, what does he mean, the first commandment? I'm going to bracket that until we get to the next verse. Okay. In the land of Egypt, Be'eretz Mitzrayim, right? Chutz lakrach, outside the city. Okay, so the land of Egypt means really like the land, not the city. Okay, and here, I mean, Mitzrayim, geographical terms, it's very interesting because Cairo in Arabic is Masr, okay, which is related to Mitzrayim, but Egypt is also. So, sometimes, it's like, it's like if you talk to somebody who lives in one of the outer boroughs and they say they're going to New York and you say, but you live in New York, you're already in New York. Because my dad, who lives in Queens, will tell me he has to go to New York. And I'll say, but Queens is part of, no. He said, no, I mean the city. And I say, no, but you live in the city. He means, Manhattan, right? So Egypt too, I mean, so an Egyptian who doesn't speak English that well will tell you that they have, Egypt when they mean Cairo. Okay, so that can be a little bit confusing, right? But here it says outside the city, maybe it means within the city. Therefore, scripture states, when I leave the city, I will spread my hands to the Lord. Now, if even at prayer, which is of minor importance, Moses did not pray within the city, a divine communication, which is of major importance, how much more so? Okay, now, I'm going to stop here because you've heard me use the term kal v'chomer, right? Kal v'chomer means from a mind, right? This is a kal v'chomer, okay? And in fact, that's what Rashi says, umat tefillah kala. Okay, so this is a kal v'chomer. In other words, in chapter 9, Moses says, I'm going to go outside the city to pray. Right? Here he says, I'm going to go speak to God. Right? If he can't pray inside the city, right? Kal v'chomer, he can't speak to God in the city. Right? I just want you to understand the concept of kal v'chomer, right? Because why is that a kal v'chomer? Because who prays? Everybody, right? Who speaks to God? Only Moses, right? So speaking to God is even higher, more serious, a greater thing than just prayer, right? So if he can't pray in the city, then kal v'chomer, he can't speak to God in the city. Why? Because it's full of idols, right? Because it's full of idols. Okay, and divine communication is supposed to only take place, in a proper spot, and sort of, I guess, the presence of idols. If you tried to speak to God in the presence of idols, you would get a message. Your connection is unstable. you wouldn't be able to speak to God because the idols sort of interfere.
What's the difference between prayer? I mean, when we pray, we all think we're speaking to God.
Right.
But God is speaking back.
That's the difference, right?
That's the difference.
So why doesn't it say, why does, I had the same question in different words. Everybody who believes in God talks to God. But there's a difference between saying speaking to or talking to, and speaking or talking with, which would infer coming back, God coming back, responding.
Right. But I mean, again, you have to look at the Hebrew, right? The Hebrew uses the term tefillah, which is kal, that means prayer. So that's one-way communication.
Right.
Dibur, that's the homer, okay? So when it's talking about dibur, what it means is God is speaking to him.
Oh, okay.
So I misspoke when I said I'm going to go speak to God. What I really mean is speak with God.
Okay.
Right? We all, the to and the with, I mean, here we need an English Rashi, right? I mean, when I say I'm going to, what?
There's some things that you always say to me, D, you take it too literally. But in this case, I think it really makes a difference. Whether
it absolutely makes a difference.
Okay.
It absolutely makes a difference, right? Because if I told you I'm going to speak to God, that's one thing. But if I say I'm going to speak with God, right, that implies that God, right, that implies a two-way communication rather than a one-way.
So a better word would have been converse.
Converse with God. Okay. converse with God. Excellent. And actually, I mean, just a point about modern Hebrew. There's no real word for discuss in modern Hebrew. There's like lisocheach, which means like to chat, and there's like ladun, which means to deliberate, right? And what's something between a chat and a deliberation would be a discussion, right? But there's no real. So you may hear somebody in modern Hebrew using the term lidaskes. Okay, lidaskes means to discuss, right? Barnaby, you've probably heard that.
I haven't.
Yeah, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's not used anymore. Again, my Israeli Hebrew is really from the 80s. So maybe they don't say lidask, but when I lived there, lidaskes was very, very common. So Moses went out to lidaskes with God over this thing. Okay. Now, back to that issue of the first commandment. All right. So God spoke to Moses and Aaron, and this is what he said. HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim. Rishon hu lachem lechodshei hashana. Okay. Now, Rashi doesn't even get into this being the first commandment. Now, for a couple of reasons. One is because the very first Rashi on Bereshit Aleph Aleph does discuss this, but it's well known, right? HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim is the first commandment. You say, it's the first commandment, right? Isn't either be fruitful and multiply the first commandment, or I am the Lord your God, you shall have no other gods before me is the first commandment? No. All right, be fruitful and multiply is the first commandment given to humanity as a whole, right? The 10 commandments, that's the 10 commandments, but there are commandments given before the 10 commandments, right? But HaChodesh hazeh lachem rosh chodashim, which is the commandment, I mean, it makes Nisan to be the first month, but it also is the commandment it continues as the commandment to take the Paschal lamb. Does anybody know why Rashi calls this the first commandment? Anyone?
Does it have something to do with the first time they're free?
No, because they're not free yet.
Okay.
But you're on the right track.
Well, it's a rebirth, a renewal, an invent of a new creation. I
Right.
feel like I'm playing charades with you. I don't know.
Well, I know I do that sometimes. Okay. This is what?
Because the first commandment to Israel as a nation, as opposed to
Right.
Right,
Gimel Menashe is technical, but this is really the first dibur.
right.
Right, exactly. This is right. There were commandments before this given to all of humanity.
Okay,
Right. And of course, God told specific people to do specific things. Right. But God telling Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, that's not one of the 613 commandments.
right.
Right. But this is the first commandment from God to the collectivity of Israel, as opposed to either to an individual or to all of humanity.
Right.
Okay, so this is the first commandment given to the Israelite people. Okay. HaChodesh hazeh. Now, again, hazeh, I mean, see, this doesn't seem so difficult that you would have to have a Rashi, right? But the issue that Rashi is commenting on is the word hazeh, okay? Because the rabbinic understanding is that wherever it says zeh, in the Torah, it means that somebody's pointing to something. Okay, right? Like matzah zeh she'anu ochlim, right? This matzah, right? You hold it up and you point to it, right? That's why certain people cannot have their stubborn and rebellious son executed, because it says benenu zeh, and they have to point to him. And if they can't point to him, they can't carry it out. Okay, so similarly, that's why, according to the Talmud, a blind person can't lead the Seder. A blind person can't lead the Seder. Why? Because you have to point to the matzah, and a blind person can't point to the matzah.
Huh.
So therefore, they can't lead the Seder.
Even if that person is assisted?
A person is what?
Supposing I'm with somebody who's blind and I hold that person's hand in the same fashion, they can't be assisted and thereby be a participant?
No, because they can't see the matzah to point at it.
Okay.
That's really interesting. I mean, our conservative modern American Jews have one Seder plate generally at the center of the table. And if you have a big Seder, the head of the Seder might not even be able to reach it, let alone uncover it or point
That's
it.
right.
And so it's routinely, you'd say to somebody, usually a kid, could you uncover and point to the matzah? And I mean, that's really, but a Chabadnik, every Chabad participant in a Seder will have his own Seder plate in front of him, in which case that problem gets taken care of by the each.
Right.
Who knew?
No, because the rabbinic understanding is that whenever it says zeh, it means pointing. Okay, this.
Yeah.
Okay, so what did God point to? He showed him the moon, right? He showed him the moon, and he pointed to it. He pointed to the moon, right? But then Rashi acknowledges that this is midrashic. He says a biblical verse does not lose its simple meaning. All right, so that's a midrashic. It doesn't mean that there's not also like a pshat, a plain meaning. He says, concerning the month of Nisan, this shall be first of the order of the number of months. So Iyar shall be called the second, and Sivan the third. Okay, now this is extremely confusing, right? I mean, it is because when is the new year, right? The new year is Rosh Hashanah,
And Tishrei.
which is Tishrei, which is the 7th month,
Right.
right? Nisan is the 1st month. Now, I mean, by us in the Gregorian calendar, the year begins the 1st of January, which is the 1st month, right? Having said that, there are all kinds of different years, right? The fiscal year generally begins, right, for most companies or corporations, July 1st, right? And somebody asked me, the other day about Tu B'Shvat. I mean, Tu B'Shvat, I mean, how do we observe Tu B'Shvat according to the halacha? We skip Tachanun, right? There's not even a Ya'aleh V'Yavo or an Al Hanisim or whatever. It's just we skip Tachanun. But what really is Tu B'Shvat? What really is Tu B'Shvat? It is the beginning of the fiscal year for trees.
Trees,
Okay.
right.
So when people say the new year of the trees, right? Everybody knows Tu B'Shvat is the new year of the trees. Okay. Then I asked, well, what does that mean? Very few people know, right? But if you're tithing your produce, right, and you have to give 10% of the produce of that year, 10%, when does it start? Right? You need to know, right? So the fiscal year for things that grow on trees is Tu B'Shvat, is the 15th of Shvat. Okay. And that's what it originally was. And then in Tzfat, they started to give it mystical meaning. And then when the Zionist movement started and we needed to raise money for trees and so on and so on. And I don't mean that as a joke, but Tu
For
B'Shvat,
sure.
Tu B'Shvat became important with the rise of Zionism. And then in America, it morphed in the 70s, really, maybe the 60s, when people came to be concerned more about the environment.
Maybe the 50s. I
Maybe the
remember it.
50s.
I remember it
Yeah.
from the 50s.
Yeah.
Okay, but from the 50s, was it about Israel or was it about trees in general?
No, so when I was little, this is 163 years ago, we had a sheet of paper with a tree, and you gave tzedakah into the blue box, and
Right.
you got a sticker, and you pasted it on your tree,
Right.
and the object was to, I think it was $1.50 buys a tree in Israel. The
Right.
whole thing was Israel
Right.
centered.
Right,
Yeah.
right. But now it's not necessarily Israel centered. It's environmental centered, not necessarily Israel. I mean, the point is that, I've spoken about this on Hanukkah, right? But the meanings of holidays change as our sort of existential
Right.
situation changes, right? And we reach into our toolkit and we say, what tool do I have to address this concern, right? And so we have in our, we have Tu B'Shvat in our toolkit, so we make it mean whatever we want it to mean. Okay.
Could you apply that to Hanukkah?
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah,
Because
sure.
I remember you're raising the point and asking us how many of us think this is all about the oil, the story of the oil in the temple. And most of us, I distinctly remember, most of us raised our hands. And you said, well, these were not your exact words, but the essence was that we really missed the underlying story, which was I believe you said it was the Maccabean fight for freedom or some such. But there again, situational.
Right, absolutely. All right.
Did you mean to go back to your whole point about why Nissan is named the first month?
No.
Okay.
I mean, we're almost at 9:00, so I wanted to find something else. Okay. So we'll go on to the next verse. And you shall keep it for inspection until the 14th day of this month, and the entire congregation of the community of Israel shall slaughter it in the afternoon. Okay, so, all right, so basically, I mean, I'm not going to read the whole thing, but two things I want to explain. That in the Torah, as understood by the rabbis, there's Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach Dorot. Okay, there was the Paschal sacrifice that took place in Egypt, the very first Paschal sacrifice, and then so that's Pesach Mitzrayim, right? The Pesach of Egypt, and then Pesach Dorot means the Pesach of the generations, and like what we I was going to say like what we do, except we don't do it, right? Because Pesach, right, in this context doesn't mean Hag HaPesach, doesn't mean it means the Korban Pesach, the Paschal sacrifice.
Right.
And there are differences between what they did in Egypt and what they did subsequently. Okay, but Rashi is basically asking, why did God make this so complicated, right? And the answer is that they were steeped in idolatry, and God wanted to give them a mitzvah to perform so they could be worthy of redemption, right? And this whole idea that, and you've certainly heard me say this before, is that, if we think that we are doing mitzvot for God because God needs these things, then that's not so, right? We're doing them for God because we need these things, right? We need something to express our love for God. We need something to bring us closer to God, but it's not for God, right? I mean, when we do the sacrifice, it's not because God is hungry and needs food, right? It's not because we don't put the blood on the lintels because otherwise God has no way of knowing who's an Israelite and who's not an Israelite.
Right.
Right? God knows who's an Israelite and who's not an Israelite, but we need something to do to express our, and also here in this particular case, since the ram was a deity for the Egyptians, right? To slaughter that deity, right? To establish God's primacy over the gods of Egypt. And that's kind of what Rashi is explaining here. So I don't have time to go into all of it, but Mike.
So just to share with the class, I once asked the rabbi, gee, it sounds obnoxious when I think back about it, but I once asked the rabbi whether does he think God cares if he waits an hour or 2 hours after eating meat before eating milk?
Right.
And he answered, I mean, he didn't even hesitate for a moment. And he said, of course not. It's what I do to express my love of God. I mean, it was like knee jerk because it's part of him. And it was really impressive, Rabbi. I just tell you, I remember that. But question, did the Paschal Lamb start with the 10th plague, or did we have a Passover, a sacrifice before that? You just said in Egypt, and I always get confused in the Seder, in the Haggadah, where the timeline of how are they doing this?
No, it would be before the 10th plague because the blood would be on the lintels before the 10th plague.
The blood on the lintels. That's the Paschal Lamb, and
right,
that's
the blood
when
on the
we
lintels
started,
is the blood of the Paschal Lamb.
and that's when we started the Passover sacrifice.
Right.
Was that the
And-
purpose of sacrificing the Paschal Lamb? Because God knew that there needed to be that symbol?
God, right, but the
You
symbol
could have
is
used
not,
any blood. You
Right,
could have
but
cut your finger.
no, because you can't use human blood, but I understand the question. The question, I don't think the sacrifice is necessary so that they will have blood, because
Okay.
God doesn't need the blood. The
Right.
sacrifice is necessary so that the Israelites will do something, will have a mitzvah to perform, and that is a mitzvah that is specifically a blow against idolatry.
Okay.
Okay.
And we
And-
commanded to put that mark outside the doorpost, not inside their house where you close the door.
Well, Rashi says inside.
Does he really?
Yeah.
Is that why people, I don't know if it's just unique to Orthodox, but I know this is Toby's custom. We have mezuzahs inside the house as well on every doorpost.
On every door, sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But all right, so if you look at Rashi on 12:13, right? And the blood will be for you for a sign upon the houses where you will be. The blood will be for you, okay? For you a sign, but not a sign for others. From here it is derived that they put the blood only on the inside. And I will see the blood. In fact, everything is revealed to him. Why then does the Torah mention that God will see the blood? Right? God doesn't need to see the blood. Rather, the Holy One, blessed be he, said, I will focus my attention to see that you are engaged in my commandments, and I will skip over you. Right? So it's very explicit. I mean, I don't, also because of time, I don't want to get too much into the weeds, right? But who here has ever been to a Catholic mass?
I have.
I have.
You ever hear the priest? You maybe didn't pay attention. Christ, our Passover, is sacrificed for us.
No.
Right? Okay.
No.
And that is why the crucifixion is connected so intimately to Passover. And it's why Easter is the only Catholic holiday. It's connected to Pesach, right?
Right, sure.
Christmas is December 25th, but Easter is connected to Pesach.
Absolutely.
Because it's theologically connected to Pesach.
Mhm.
Jesus becomes the Paschal Lamb.
Right.
The blood of the Lamb has
Right.
redemptive power, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, again, it's way into the weeds.
It's not really.
But
That's
there's this intimate connection, right, between Judaism and Christianity, of course, but between Pesach and Good Friday and Easter, right? I mean, even to the extent that in many languages, like in Spanish, Easter is Pascua.
Right.
Pesach is also Pascua, which leads to lots of confusion sometimes, right? But the two are intimately connected, and it gets back to this very section of Exodus. Okay, yeah, Barnaby.
So this isn't related to the Jesus thing at all. How God observed the blood on the door, and it's a sign of the Israelites who did that ritual respecting the commandments. But then I remember this. I don't know if it's Midrash or Pshat, but I think 2/3 or the majority of the Israelite nation in Egypt did not leave in the Exodus. And it just gets me wondering if they were the population that chose not to observe the Paschal sacrifice and then perished.
Right. Good question.
Right. It's Midrash, it's not Pshat.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a Midrash that's based in a Pshat, because where it says, V'chamushim alu b'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim, and which probably means arms, because like Hamush means arm, tachmoshet, but the Midrashic understanding is 1/5 of the Israelites went up from Egypt. The other 80% stayed behind. Okay. All right. We ran over. That's okay. Thank you. I thought this was a good discussion. Good class.
Yashika.
And
This is good.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Right.
Shabbat shalom.
Rabbi, I was taught that you mark the blood. We were told to mark the blood on the lintels, on the doorpost, and obviously the angel of death knew who was Jewish, but you had to mark it on the outside of your door. There were those Jews who were passing, who were not um, interested in being counted as a Jew because of the Tzuris, and so the angel of death slaughtered their firstborn as well. But that's I mean, it's not in the text at all. So it's just something I was taught. I don't know where it came from.
Well, I mean, it's also, look, I mean, midrashic explanations often have nothing to do with the original context. Okay. In other words, look, if you're talking about something that you were taught in the 1950s, right? Assimilation was a big concern, right? Assimilation was a big concern. I mean, when is the last time you heard of a Jew changing their name so that people wouldn't know that they were Jew? Doesn't happen anymore. Right? Doesn't happen anymore, but it was happening certainly in the 50s.
And that was the example given, was just like with African Americans, there were some Jews who tried to pass.
Right.
Whether it's in the US or South Africa or wherever.
Right. So
not
that
uncommon occurrence.
That midrash, whoever told that is an anti-assimilation midrash, right? Because if you connected to what Barnaby said, right? So they tried to pass, but then they were struck down.
Exactly.
Right. So, I mean, it's always helpful when you're looking at a midrash, right? Just like when you're looking at Rashi, right? You have to ask yourself, ma kashel Rashi, right? What is the question that Rashi's trying to answer, right? Because you can't understand the answer if you don't understand the question, right? But the same with midrash, right? What is the existential situation that this midrash is really addressing, right? It's not merely an attempt to explain the text. It's not. I mean, sometimes it can be, but usually it's not an attempt to explain the text. It's an attempt to make the text speak to your existential situation. All right. Now I'm really going to go. Good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now can we leave? Shabbat shalom.
Shabbat shalom.
Shalom.